This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW, flyers. That's 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 170, entitled The Coming Civil, in brackets, Sex, War. Description. This flyer predicts that if the massive gender injustices against men continue, there will be warfare as militant, in quotes, John Brown-like MGTOW/masculists and their disciples take the law into their own hands, since the current law does not look out for them. Now for the flyer itself. The coming civil, in brackets, sex war. I'm becoming increasingly aware that a real war between the sexes is coming, as I reflect on the massive injustices that are committed routinely and unconsciously against men, who are half the population. I'm predicting a war is coming. And by a war, I mean deaths, terrorists, assassinations, arsons, killings, murders, etc. That is, a war involving millions of people. Why do I say this? Because I see close analogies between the causes of the US Civil War in the 1860s and the current situation with men. The fundamental cause of the US Civil War was over the issue of Negro slavery. There was so much moral indignation coming from the northern states that the southern slave states, who depended on slavery for their economic survival, felt deeply existentially threatened. Eventually, over a century, the moral pressure from the northern abolitionists mounted to such a point that the South felt their only option was to secede from the Union, which is what they did. Lincoln then invaded the South in a dictatorial manner, forcing the South to stay in the Union, rather like the way Russia invaded Chechnya to keep it in the Soviet Union. The Southerners rightfully were outraged that their states had been invaded by the North to force Southerns to do what the Northerners wanted. They saw Lincoln as a dictator, which of course he was. So the Southerners felt both threatened by economic catastrophe if their slaves were freed, and outraged by the Northern dictatorship. Today, we have a similar situation where men are growing increasingly conscious that they are manslaves to women and are becoming increasingly angry. More and more men are being financially massacred in the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce courts and having their lives ruined. Roughly 1 married man in 4 in the US is going through this hell and has become increasingly hateful and vengeful as a result. A war against the current gender norms is brewing. The status quo cannot continue. Now that women have the contraceptive pill, the greatest social revolution in prehistory, women can control effectively the number of kids they want, which is now 0, 1 or 2, which means that they have a career window of some 40 plus years. The masculists say, quote, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is exploitation of the labour of men, end quote. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to be FIPs, financially independent persons, who bother to get a FIP major education, for example, in the STEM, S-T-E-M, science, tech, engineering, math field, so that they can be FIPs as adults and not look around for some manslave to parasite upon, to pay for her to live in a middle-class house in which to raise her children. The problem now is that men are being truly screwed by the takeover by the fluffy feminists of the divorce courts, so that a massive gender injustice is being committed daily in them, where divorcing fathers typically lose their kids, their house, pay child support and alimony to their fluffy ex-wives. This callous abuse of men, who make up half the population, cannot continue. If it does, there will be warfare. What form will this warfare take? Again, I use a historical analogy with the US Civil War. Some of you may have heard of John Brown, of the song. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave and his soul goes marching on. John Brown was a northern militant abolitionist who tried to capture a northern armory and distribute guns to the blacks in the South to cause an insurrection against Negro slavery. He was intercepted by northern soldiers and hanged. At his hanging, he made the following famous speech, quote, "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." A mere 2 years later, the US was caught up in a bloody civil war that ended up killing over 500,000 soldiers. Today's men see themselves increasingly as man-slaves to women and are increasingly rebelling against the traditional man-slave role of working for women. You can look at MGTOW and masculism as a, quote, rebellion by men against working for women, end quote. MGTOWs, that's men going their own way, refuse to marry, refuse to have kids and spend their money on themselves. Most women know nothing about MGTOW/masculism, so by default have traditional fluffy, a traditional woman who expects to be able to parasite off the money of a manslave, attitudes towards men, expecting them to pay for women to have babies in houses that men pay for. This attitude is deeply ingrained in women, probably in their DNA, since men have always provided resources to women so that women could raise the next generation. But we now live in the era of the pill, so traditional, evolved gender norms are no longer applicable. Men have the possibility of not working as manslaves for women, and millions of young men in the US and Japan are now choosing that lifestyle. In the US and Japan, 70% of young men under 35 refuse to marry, refuse to have kids, and spend their money on themselves. They're on strike, and despite the parasitic attitudes of women. Many such men, MGTOW/masculists, have such a low opinion of women, whom they see as exploiters, who judge men only by their exploitability by women, that these men choose to have nothing to do with them, not even sexing them in many cases. The problem is with the divorce courts, which is the front line in the war between the sexes. The MGTOW/masculist movements are now growing exponentially. In a few years, MGTOW/masculist ideas will be known by everyone, and these ideas will influence the thinking and actions of divorcing men, who will use MGTOW/masculist ideas to hit back at society for financially massacring them and ruining their lives. They will react with murderous hatred. As soldiers for men's lib, in effect, they will be masculist MGTOW John Browns. As the population continues to crash due to the paternity strike of the MGTOWs masculists, the temperature in the debate on men's lib and society's abuse of men will rise and rise. Recently divorced men who have had their kids ripped from them, their house stolen by the state and given to the fluffy ex-wife, made poor paying their fluffy ex-wife child support and alimony, they will latch on to the ideas of MGTOWs masculists and take their revenge. They will assassinate divorce court judges. They will murder the divorce court lawyers who took the side of the ex-wife. They will arson the divorce courts. They will paint slogans on the outer walls of these divorce courts. Crime seen against men. The more far-sighted ones will travel to Washington, D.C. and assassinate the gender politicians who created the massively unjust gender laws against men that have ruined the lives of literally millions of men. These militant MGTOW masculist terrorists, warriors, soldiers, will believe that what they are doing is for men, for men's lib. They will believe that a war is necessary because the current gender roles are indirectly wiping out whole populations, because the fluffy feminists don't care about men. The fluffy feminists exploit the gender politicians' short-term thinking to extract resources from their ex-husbands and treat them as cash machines. MGTOWs masculists have such a hatred of this fluffy feminist attitude that increasingly more MGTOWs masculists feel that a civil war, a civil sex war, is brewing, so that if the gender laws are not made men fair soon, thousands of John Brown masculist MGTOWs will come out of the woodwork, and the assassinations and murders will begin and not stop, so that it becomes clear that a civil sex war has started. The gender politicians and society in general need to be made aware that you cannot abuse men in the way society, the media, the divorce courts, etc. are currently doing and not expect a massive backlash from men. Young men particularly are reacting strongly, choosing to go their own way, rebelling against being manslaves to fluffy parasites. As the population crashes and the temperature in the men's lib debate rises and rises, measures taken by MGTOW masculists will become more extreme. They will argue that extreme circumstances, that is, the population getting wiped out, calls for extreme measures, that is, a war, a civil sex war, to force the men-fairing of society, the men-fairing of the gender laws, the reform of the divorce courts, the bringing in of the paternity rejection right, the systematic removal of legal discrimination against men across the board, etc. If this does not happen, men in their thousands, then millions, will start taking up arms and taking the law into their own hands because they are not getting gender justice from the current law, which so massively discriminates against men, treating men as things, as cash machines, without feelings and without need for respect. The longer society, and particularly the fluffy feminists and the gender politicians, continue to do this, the more they will be targeted for assassination and murder, thus generating a killing war, a civil sex war. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name DeGaris, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers.